Some of your friends miss it, we obviously want you to know we'll be up on YouTube eventually. So, Mr. Wallace, thank you for joining us tonight. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, glad to be with you guys. Looking
Yeah, it's
forward
great
to
to
it.
great to see you again, and I know you're busier than ever. I see your stuff every day, and so you've written this incredible book, this new book called Person of Interest that Frank Turk was just raving about last week. So if he likes it, everybody likes it. But why don't you quickly, before you start, just tell us what was the formation of this book? I mean, what you got you going in this direction, just real quick before you start.
Well, people ask me to kind of talk about Jesus, and I can only talk about it in the context of my own journey in, right? Which was based on looking at the evidence. And evidence, when I look at cases, because I'm looking at mostly unsolved murders, they're unsolved for a reason, right? Because they didn't have a really clear, simple one or two piece case they could have put in front of a jury 30 years ago. So they end up being unsolved, and you have to make the case by collecting bits and pieces of evidence. I call it death by a thousand paper cuts. These things don't necessarily seem like they're all that significant until you see them in their totality. And these are the kinds of cases that we make consistently, cumulative cases built on circumstantial evidence. When I was looking at Christianity, for me, I built the case the same way. And that means you're looking at things that are both in places that you wouldn't expect to look. And that's often what we're trying to do, is be creative with these cases where maybe the first set of investigators was looking at how the dominoes fall and not thinking about, well, if this domino falls, is it going to push over dominoes over on that line? Probably. And so maybe we should be looking on that line also. And so you're always looking outside of what maybe the first set of investigators had considered. And so that's what I was trying to do with Jesus. So the first book I wrote about Jesus is Cold Case Christianity. That looks at the reliability of the New Testament. And I've been out to the campus with you to talk about that. And then this book does just the opposite of what Cold Case does. This imagines a scenario in which there are no New Testaments available to read. If you're imagine, we'll talk about that a little bit in the presentation. And how would you know anything about Jesus? This is often the same way we work no body murder cases. So that's the premise for the book. We're looking at, kind of a two-part case, one from all the evidence in the Gospels, the other from all the evidence outside the Gospels. If that makes sense to you, Eric. You're on mute, brother.
I'll tell you, these Zoom calls are how many you do them, you still miss that sometimes. Well, once again, we appreciate so much and all you're doing. You are just so busy with all your work, and we'll just go ahead and let you talk
Let's
about the
jump
book and
in.
do a little
Yeah.
presentation. Then maybe at the end we'll do a few,
Yep,
a few questions
I've
here and
shortened
there.
it to the point where I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. So just hold on to your questions. You don't have to stick them in the chat if you don't want to. Probably you'll be able to ask them here at the end. And let's just jump right in. I'm going to share a screen real quick,
Great.
and off we go. Okay, so the topic we're going to talk about tonight is just one chapter out of the book, and I thought about trying to do more, but it gets to be pretty long. So I wanted to give you a chance to ask questions. We're just going to talk about this basic premise, this basic question: is Christianity anti-science? A book like this not only presents a case, but it also answers objections that others might offer, and that's what we're trying to do with this question. Do we have any reason to believe that science is somehow the antithesis of faith or of Christianity? Now, a lot of the work, as I told you before, is my work from a perspective of a cold case detective. That's what I do. My son is still doing the same job. He's now responsible for about 60% of the content on our website. Is just Jimmy's videos and articles that he's writing. And he's been doing that job for 10 years. I did that job for about 26. And my dad did it for 28 before me. We've been there at the same agency with the same name, doing the same job for 60 years last June. So a lot of this is just the same stuff that detectives have been doing for years and years. And I got a chance to kind of talk about this a little bit in one scene of God's Not Dead 2. We're going to jump right into this from that unique perspective, the perspective you might take if you were working a case. And a lot of this is going to be out of the book. Well, all of this tonight will be out of the book, Person of Interest, where we really talk about this unusual approach you might take with the case for Christianity. Imagine that future world we talked about, that dystopian future universe in which all somehow that some evil regime has collected every New Testament Bible, every New Testament manuscript, and burned them all. It has successfully gotten rid of every single copy of the New Testament and its foundational manuscripts. what would we know about Jesus? If Jesus is God, would that be enough to get rid of the story of Jesus? Would you think that if Jesus is God, there might be some other evidence for Jesus, even if we lost the New Testament manuscripts? Well, in fact, there is, and I'll talk about that tonight. Sometimes you have cases where you have good evidence in a crime scene. You know, the body is still there. There's a weapon next to the body. You can collect blood evidence and DNA evidence and material evidence and forensic evidence. You can collect all this stuff. You can even put a yellow tape around everything because it's pretty clear that there was a felony that occurred here because the body is still there. But I've had a number of cases where there is no body. Sometimes a guy will kill his husband, his wife, or a woman will kill her husband, and will just claim that that person ran off. And they'll file a missing persons report, and they'll take that report and assume that it's correct. And I had a case where 30 years had gone by. In those 30 years, the family of the missing person never once called us to ask us if we were working the case, because they had been so utterly convinced by the suspect in the case that their daughter had run off, and they didn't want to believe she was dead. So when I reopened the case, I got a problem. I've got no crime scene. None was ever photographed. I've got no body. How do I know, even though I might suspect this guy, how do I know that he really is a person of interest if I don't have any evidence, any body, any way to tell the difference? Well, I always tell people when we go to the jury, typically, and when we investigate this, we've got to remember that cases like this are part of a timeline. There is a period of time before the crime occurs, and there's a period of time after the crime occurs. As a matter of fact, it's kind of like you're looking at a runway leading up to an event. And to be honest, if she is missing because he did something nefarious to her, well, then it's as if a bomb went off on the day that she vanished. And bombs are explosive, and they always have a fuse that burns for any period of time up to the explosion of that bomb. And then once that fuse slowly burns toward the detonation point, and then the bomb explodes, well, now you've got shrapnel and debris lying all over the blast radius. So how do you know what happened at that day that she went missing? Well, I don't have any evidence in the crime scene, and I have no body, but I do have a fuse and I do have fallout that I can investigate. And it turns out that that fuse and fallout will tell us exactly what happened on the day of the felony. So in a criminal trial, it kind of looks like this, where you're showing them all of the elements of the fuse, all the interaction of the husband, all the movements of the husband, preparing to get rid of the body in advance, getting the weaponry together, all the stuff that people do in preparation for a homicide. And then you have that period of time afterwards and all of his interaction with his friends, things he says, things he does that are suspicious. These things in the fuse and fallout demonstrate that he is a felon. Well, could you do the same thing with the explosive appearance of Jesus in the timeline of history? I think you could, and that's what we're doing in Person of Interest. We're looking at the fuse leading up to the appearance of Jesus and the fallout of history following Jesus, because it turns out you can make a case for the historicity and deity of Jesus, even if every New Testament had been destroyed. You can make this case just from the fuse and the fallout. So tonight, all we're going to do is look at one of 10 chapters we've written on this. We won't look at anything in the fuse. We're not going to look at almost anything in the fallout, except for this piece of data, which is really science. Surprisingly, science and the history of science tell us everything we need to know about Jesus, and can only be explained if Jesus is in fact who he said he was. Let me show you what I mean. You've probably seen tweets like this at times, this idea that, hey, science would have been 1,500 years ahead if it hadn't been for the church. It's the church that's dragging science back by its coattails. It's the church that's burning our best minds at the stake. Now, I've heard this a number of times from all kinds of different people. For example, this quote is often quoted from Catherine Fahringer, who was the first one who ever wrote about it. So the question is that true? Has Christianity been a science stopper? Actually, nothing can be further from the truth. Let me just give you a timeline. Here's our timeline of about 4,000 years from then to now. If we were to look at the history of science over that period of time, you would see that it begins in antiquity with just the establishment of the kind of foundational principles of mathematics and philosophy of science and some foundational ideas about physics. These are the things that kind of are written by the ancients, but it's very primitive. And then eventually you start to see the kind of slow and steady drumbeat of people who in those days were called natural philosophers, who were at least beginning to think about all things that we now label as science. But you'll see that it's pretty consistent and pretty minimal. But then, you see a bump in activity. And as time progresses, you see more and more small bumps or large bumps over time in kind of lurch and go forward, up and down, hills and valleys of activity. Some are greater than others. And eventually you have this explosion into the modern era. And in this period, there's a 200-year period of time called the scientific revolution. So the question is, and this, by the way, these are the images. If you just simply Google top scientists or natural philosophers in each century, you'll come up with the same list that I did. And then you can find your own images of those people like I did, and you can make a chart just like I did. So you have here the steady growth and of the sciences. Now, what's interesting to me, let's take a look at this chart, okay? What's interesting to me is that you have that steady drumbeat, right, in the earliest centuries, and then you have something change where you begin to see this growth. Where is Jesus in this timeline? He's right here. Isn't that interesting? He's before the curve. He didn't have to be there. He could easily have been over here on the timeline. Or he could have been way over here in the middle of the exploration, or even maybe deeper into the exploration of science. But it turns out he's over here, just before it all takes off. So why is that? Is that a coincidence? Or is somehow Jesus a catalyst for this kind of work? Now, it's been observed that most of what happens when it comes to scientific explosion of scientific research occurs in Christendom, and it occurs in Europe. And people will say, well, yeah, but everyone who was in Europe, in the 16th and 17th centuries during the scientific revolution, they were all Christians. Yeah, but there were more people outside of Europe and who weren't Christians. Why didn't science explode in Asia? Why is it that science takes off to the level it takes off, and all of the major scientific disciplines are founded during the scientific revolution in Christendom in Europe, rather than someplace else? Could have been Persia, could have been India, could have been China. It could have been lots of places where lots of people live, but no, it's in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. What is it? Is there some connection between the Christian worldview and the exploration of science? Well, let me just show you some coincidences, perhaps, in the timeline. This first bump in scientific activity you'll see in history occurs, coincidentally, about the same time that the Roman edicts of Milan and Thessalonica reduce hostility and eliminate hostility toward Christians, and actually legalize and make Christianity the religion of the empire. Then you see another bump in activity here. That bump in activity happens to coincide with the establishment of the monasteries and the cathedral schools. Those are important because those are precursor institutions that actually lead to the modern university as we know it today. Then you have another bump right here. And I'll be honest with you, this bump includes the activity of an entire people group that are not Christians. This bump includes Muslims who were intensely involved in the development of sciences from the initiation, from the beginning of Islam until about the Middle Ages, till about the 12th century or so. And then they drop off the map. Now, there's been lots of speculation as to why Islam stops contributing in this way. It's probably based on theological ideas. There's a book called The Closing of the Muslim Mind that tries to explore why this happened. But I just want you to see that there's a bump here that I think involves largely Muslims who are now part of the project, who then no longer are part of the project to the degree they are here, at least, once we get to the scientific revolution. This bump here, for example, is the bump that happens to coincide with the formation of universities. So the first three universities, as we know, don't be, of course, I know that there were ancients who educated themselves in one kind of institution or another, but they weren't like the modern university you're thinking of, like Ohio State. This idea of a campus in which a body of students will come to learn underneath a body of faculty that are resident there, that actually graduate you from year to year and eventually award you a diploma when you've completed your studies. That idea of what the modern university does is entirely Christian, formed at 3 universities at Bologna, Oxford, and Paris. This bump here happens to coincide with Gutenberg's printing press, a Christ follower who first printed the Bible as his first document. And this bump here, just at the scientific revolution, just happens to coincide with the Reformation. Now, this could all be coincidence, but I want you to know that in this body of work here, the scientific revolution is nearly entirely Christ followers. Christianity had an incredibly oversized impact in the scientific revolution. Why? Well, it turns out there might be a worldview that is different, that really acted as a catalyst. There are certain igniters. For example, many of the ancients who were doing natural philosophy did not have a high view of matter. The idea that matter was somehow either evil, fallen, dirty, vile, was not worthy of study. Gnostics, for example, held this view. Many ancient thinkers thought that ideas were the true reality, and that the forms taken in the material world were actually kind of not inconsequential, but a less than worthy aspect of the ideal. But Christianity offers a view that says that matter is actually good and worthy of study. We are not seen, for example, as entirely immaterial souls. We don't die and then eventually find ourselves without resurrection bodies. No, we actually get a resurrection body. Think about that. There's lots of views in which after you leave the material world, you're nothing more than a disembodied soul. But the idea of matter is important to Christians. And this simple idea that matter is actually not evil and worthy of study begins a study of the material world. And in fact, if you think about the gods that preceded Christianity, the pantheon of gods here, I've got several images here, and I put clothes on most of these images of the gods because if I'm honest with you, the paintings of the gods are pretty depraved. I had to put clothes on all of these gods because the pantheon of gods is capricious and debaucherous and will steal the wives and spouses of humans and murder people and do all kinds of evil things. The pantheon of gods is actually pretty crazy if you think about it, and irrational and unpredictable. But under Christianity, there is a single, orderly, rational God. And that kind of a world is worthy of study. Why would you expect the world to even make any sense if the gods who rule the world are so disorderly themselves? But under Christianity, Yahweh is both orderly, monotheistic religion in which there's a rational God. So, for example, if you are in a pantheon of gods, and these gods are actually responsible for the things we see in nature, like, Zeus is responsible for lightning and Poseidon is responsible for currents, there isn't much reason to study what might be happening because these gods are not detached from their environment. And you could simply say, well, the lightning is here because Zeus said it should be so, or this current is such because Poseidon is making it so. But under Christianity, God is detached from his creation. So that you could actually study laws of nature and the material world and not just attribute everything to the absolute interaction in real time of a God who is making it so. Think about this also. I mean, you've all had teachers and professors in your university experience, and some of them are really good. Because if your physics teacher is just geeked out on physics, he's probably a pretty good teacher. He's just geeked out on this kind of stuff. But even the most interested professor and scientist who is intensely interested in his subject matter is slightly different than, say, an ancient or a contemporary today who sees his work as an extension of his worship. And this is what people like Kepler, for example, how they treated their investigations. It wasn't just that they were interested in physics. It wasn't just that they were interested in the math and the science. It's that they saw this interaction as a study of God's nature, as an act of worship. Kepler says, I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our own minds, but rather above all else of the glory of God. All of this is our scientists who are not just interested, they are devout. and they're devout in their worship, which is reflected in their work. There's a lot of stuff that's missing from Scripture, from the special revelation of the Bible. You have to at least admit that, because here, for example, you've got different verse counts in all of the Gospels. Clearly, the Gospel of Mark contains less information than the Gospel of, say, Matthew. Clearly, the Gospel of John contains less information than the Gospel of Luke. And John even says this in his Gospel, that, we're not writing about everything that could be written. If we wrote everything that could be written, there wouldn't be enough books that could hold this information. There's a sense in which there's probably even more than was ever written by anyone, which makes sense, because each Gospel author is writing about what he thinks is important. And that's not to be meant to be everything that could be written. Now, that's interesting, because people like Galileo, for example, saw the difference. He once said the Bible shows the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go. And in that statement, he's separating two kinds of revelation. There is the special revelation of the Bible, and there is the natural revelation seen in the heavens. In other words, there is a book of Scripture that's already been completed. You and I can't add to the book of Scripture, but it turns out we can make observations about nature. And now we're engaged in this process of worshiping God with our minds by exploring the book of nature. And a lot of what's been written about nature still has to be written. Now, Paul said it this way when writing to the Romans. He said, look, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen. So it's clear that you can see some things in the book of nature that should tell you something about God. And even David, when writing in Psalms, says it this way: the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands, day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, and they use no words, and no sound is heard from them. Then how in the world can they proclaim something if they don't have any speech and they use no words? Well, that's called the scientific project. Yes, these things, the heavens do declare something. You just have to take a look and write down what it is the heavens declare. And this is why we see that modern scientists who are Christ followers end up treating science as an exploration of God. Here's, for example, Werner von Braun says that although I know of no reference to Christ ever commenting on scientific work, I do know that he said, ye shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. Thus, I'm certain that were he among us today, Christ would encourage scientific research as modern man's most noble striving to comprehend and admire his Father's handiwork. So this acts as an igniter that Christ's followers believed they could actually better understand God. And that motivates a lot of people. Now, interestingly, Christ's followers are also not afraid to get their hands dirty. And that was something that was unusual, because if you don't think that matter is worthy of study, and you're not somebody who wants to be engaged in cutting up and dissecting and digging up, well, look, the monks in monasteries were already doing this. In this environment, they were already touching the sick, healing the sick, tending to the sick. They were gardening. They were working in the fields. They were working with their hands. Unsurprisingly, then, this is the group who eventually finds no problem doing autopsies, doing dissections. This view that I can actually explore the world with more than my mind. Remember, science was first called natural philosophy, because there were no ways to actually empirically confirm your observations. No microscopes, no telescopes, at least initially. But this group says, no, we can actually get our fingers dirty, and we're not afraid to do so. And that becomes a catalyst, because these are doing both physical and intellectual investigations of the natural world. And finally, there was one more catalyst, one more igniter for the sciences. I'm going to show you the oldest painting we have of a university classroom. It's in Bologna, one of the first 3 Christian universities. Here it is. And you can tell this is a classroom, because right here, there you have it, another sleeping student. Not unusual, right, in classrooms? And this is Bologna today. Well, it turns out that most scientific explorations that you see, even today, many scientific explorations are happening on the labs and campuses and facilities of modern universities. And the Christian universities that form those 3 at Bologna and at Oxford and at Paris, they gave birth to about 24 daughter universities that then became the daughter universities from which the vast majority of scientists emerged in the scientific revolution. They all came out of those 24 daughter universities of the first 3 founded by Jesus followers. So here you have that growth curve. And it turns out there's good reason why this growth curve follows Jesus. It's not just a coincidence. It's that Christ followers have this tremendously oversized impact on science. And it can be described no other way. Now, I want to show you, imagine that we were to make a Hall of Fame for Christians who are doing science. It's got a rotunda like at Canton, right? Where you've got right there in your own state, you've got the Hall of Fame for the football players, and every room's got a bust from football players who are in the Hall of Fame. Well, imagine that we did the same kind of thing for Jesus, tracing the impact that Jesus had on the sciences. So here's our Hall of Fame of scientists. I'll start in antiquity. The first room is going to have just the busts of those people in antiquity, the most ancient of times, who actually, this is just tip of the iceberg. So I'm only going to show you the famous scientists. For every one of these, there's going to be hundreds, and later on in history, thousands more who don't become famous for their research, who don't make the pages of a Wikipedia page or of a encyclopedia or of a book on science. But I want you to see these. Now, one of these ends up being the father of the modern Kalam cosmological argument. And his name is right here. I'm just going to show you John Philoponus. So I just want you to see that every time I show you a rotunda, I'm going to try to show you the fathers of disciplines or the mothers of disciplines. Here, for example, is kind of the tip of the iceberg in the Dark Ages. I just wanted you to see these are the foremost thinkers and scientists who are Christians in the Dark Ages. And I think three of them are fathers of specific disciplines within the sciences. Here, for example, is the tip of the scientific iceberg in the Middle Ages. And so you've got, these are not Dark Ages from a Christian Science perspective. There are lots of folks doing science who become the founders and leading, these modern disciplines were started by Christ followers. Here's the tip of the scientific iceberg in the early Renaissance. I just want you to see this. You can tell it's becoming more populated. And there are a lot of fathers of disciplines in this group. And you can see them here. Now, granted, I'm not going to expect you to write these down, but I just want, this is the kind of stuff we're talking about in the book. The book is fully illustrated. There's over 400 illustrations in the book, and all of these folks are illustrated in the book as well. This is the tip of the scientific iceberg in the scientific revolution. Now, interestingly, there are some bunch of fathers in here too. I saw these guys and I couldn't help but think this has got to be the fathers of every ridiculously long-haired 90s rock band, right? But no, it turns out that's not actually who they are. They are fathers of other disciplines. I'll just give you the lists of all of their, it's hard to give you names for all of these, but I'll give you a shot. These are the kind of all-stars within the all-stars who are the fathers of disciplines. And I don't expect you to be able to write all that down. But interestingly, this also during this period of time that the academies of science emerge, and we have winners of medals that these academies are honoring leaders. And so here, for example, are the four of the most renowned, well-known academies of honor that actually offer awards. And these were all started by Christ followers or dominated by Christ followers. And you have award winners. I just wanted you to see these are what they look like. Also, I'll just go back and take a look at our Hall of Fame. Now we're going to go into a period of time that you might think, okay, this is the problem, right? All the stuff we talked about so far is pre-Darwin. So now we've got Darwin on scene. And he provides a worldview in which you don't even need God in order to explain the transition of species, the kind of progress of biology. You can kind of write under Darwinism, you can kind of write God out of the picture in one way or another. So why would you be surprised then that with that kind of alternative meta-narrative, that you would have less people in the sciences who are identifying themselves as people who believe in God, and certainly who then are Christians as a subset of those who believe in God, especially if you have an overarching narrative, which someone claims is based in science, that eliminates the need for God altogether. So if I'm not surprised that then in this period of time, you're going to have less people doing science who are calling themselves Christ followers, except that that's exactly opposite the case. You actually have more people who are Christ followers who are working during this period, many of whom now are engaging the issue of evolution head on. And they are actually engaging it either from a positive or negative way, and either coming alongside and doing work which actually supports, because they don't, like a lot of these folks, like this gentleman right here in the corner, did not believe that there was a conflict between, and some of these guys did not see a conflict between a claim about evolution and the existence of God, or even the truth of Christianity and the truth of Jesus. And so a lot of these folks end up being fathers of evolution disciplines, even though they are Christ followers. Interesting, right? Now, in this period, these are the fathers of disciplines here. I just want you to see the disciplines they're fathers of. Yes, that includes the evolutionary sciences. That includes mathematics. Every form of mathematics. That includes all of the philosophies of science. And every single major scientific discipline in every single category. All of them. And even in the regions, wherever you are in the world, probably the father of that discipline in your region of the world was also a Christ follower. And in medicine, yeah, every major discipline in medicine. Even in just simple things like if you drove or flown in the last couple of months, you're indebted to somebody who was a Christ follower who initiated those disciplines. And if you're using your phone and plugged it in to get it recharged, you can thank Christ followers for that. And I'm using a computer, and I can thank Christ followers for that. Every aspect of engineering and technology has a Christ follower somewhere. And all the cool stuff, right? Like if you used a calendar to set your calendar for this thing tonight, you can thank a Christian for that. If you like sweets and dessert, I'm about ready to have dinner and have dessert myself. And basically it's going to be a big Costco apple pie, which now my wife buys. An apple pie, a whole apple pie, even though there's just the two of us now. So I end up eating the entire apple pie in like 3 days. It's ridiculous. But anyway, you can thank a Christian for that. If you like honey on your toast, you can thank a Christian for that. If you just like things like, I like steaks, you can thank a Christian for that. My kids have all jumped out of planes. I won't do it, but they want to do it. Great. They can thank a Christian for that. It turns out I like submarines and movies about submarines, but submarines are a product of Christian thinking. As a matter of fact, I hope you never need this, but if you ever do need this, you can thank a Christian for it. And finally, look, fly fishing is fun. That's a Christian involved in that. Every major scientific field of study dominated by Christians. Did you even know that? Does anybody even teach that anymore? The number of Christians involved in the sciences is sick. And they're all award winners. So we've won awards in every single major category of awards won by scientists. We've won all these. Yeah, and we won all these too. Yeah, and we won all these too. Oh, did I mention we won all these too? Oh yeah, we got these two. And that one on the bottom there, that's the one that everyone thinks is the best one. That's called the Nobel Prize. Well, do you realize that Nobel Prize winners, there haven't been a lot of work done on worldview held by Nobel Prize winners in the sciences, but here's the most recent work done. And if you look at it, you'll see that when it comes to atheists and agnostics, you might think that all scientists are atheists and agnostics, but in terms of Nobel Prize winners, they're a very small percentage. And you have a lot of other kind of spiritual thinkers, but this is a huge group over here. This is the biggest group right here. And if you look at the Judeo-Christian worldview, it's going to occupy well more than 86% of all Nobel Prize winners in the sciences. These are the people, I've only shown you dead guys so far. These are the people who are still alive right now who are doing this work. Then most of them are all prize winners. And 2 of them are endorsers on my book. And they're smart thinkers who are doing great work in apologetics, Christian apologetics. So it turns out that you have to remember that Christ followers initiated every branch of study, and they've outperformed every other group. Let's see, every other group combined. Think about that. So I know lots of people who will say, look, I only trust science. Science is the source of all truth. And if I can't trust it unless a scientist says it. How many times have you ever heard that? Let me just show you. It turns out lots of people had something to say about Jesus. The church fathers, for example, these are the people in antiquity, the first 300 years. This is the ante-Nicene church fathers. This is everyone who was a leader in the church up to the point at which the church became the religion of the empire, right? The Christian church. All these folks had something to say about Jesus. And I get it. Most people don't trust what these folks say about Jesus. They think, yeah, these are all church fathers. Can't trust church fathers. But it turns out The science fathers say the exact same thing about Jesus. Oh, how do I know that? Because I actually researched the fathers of disciplines, and we dominate the fathers of every discipline. And those people actually wrote journals and letters in which they expressed their beliefs about Jesus and often repeated passages of scripture. So if you were trying to reconstruct the story of Jesus and all you had was the history of science, here's what you would know. You would know all of this about his early life. You know all of this about his teaching. You'd be able to reassemble, and I'm only doing a few of these because I guess I suspect that it's so many, it's 100 times better than this. But I mean, who's going to do this work, right? I mean, I just did it. I've actually footnoted it in the book so you can see who it is I'm quoting, but everything about the ministry of Jesus, everything about his mission, all the theology, what he did, and that he preached. And he had interaction with people like John the Baptist, and that he had followers, and here are their names, and that he had interactions with these disciples, and here's what he said to them, and here's how he interacted with them. And get this, these scientists studying the natural world had no problem believing that he did all those miracles. They saw no rub between the miraculous activity and the deity of Jesus and their science. They gave him the same titles. And they believed, and they wrote about his crucifixion, and they wrote about his resurrection. You get more data from the fathers of science than you get from the fathers of the church. The science fathers agree with the fathers of the church. So if you're the kind of person who says, you know, I only can trust what scientists tell me, well, do you trust what they say about Jesus? Because they say a lot. Now, we started by looking at this idea of a fuse and a fallout, and we flipped that coin a little bit and talked a little bit about what that would look like if we were looking at the fuse and fallout of history related to Jesus. And I get it. There's, we only talked about one piece. I didn't talk at all, for example, about the fallout that Jesus had related to literature. But it turns out no one's been written about more than Jesus of Nazareth. Absolutely nobody has been written about more. In terms of screenplays, ancient sources, you can do a search right now at the Library of Congress or a search on Google Books. There is no other historical figure who's been written about more than Jesus of Nazareth. None. And there are even Christ figures in fiction in which people have taken the story of Jesus in its broadest outline and applied them and created fictional characters that resemble Jesus. I've got a list of those in the book. And from just the literature in the first 300 years of both, by the way, all the gray in the background, all the grayed out, those are non-Christian sources, non-Christian voices. There are more non-Christian voices in the first 300 years than there are Christian voices describing Jesus. And from those voices, you can reassemble and reconstruct the story of Jesus. All of this can be known from non-Christian literature. Also, no one has had the same impact as Jesus on the arts, the entire history of art. If you just simply look at every master in every classic period of art history, all the way from abstract and pop art, Dada and all the impressionism, go through the entire list. Now, my background is in design. I have a bachelor's degree in design and a master's degree in architecture, and then I became a detective. This part of the process I love because this demonstrates his impact. No one has inspired more art. If you simply Google, there's maybe about 30 different genres of art through art history. Google the top 3 masters in each genre. Then look at their catalog. Every single one, without exception, has painted, etched, sculpted, or drawn Jesus of Nazareth, even if it's mockingly. I've got Warhol up here, right? I mean, Salvador Dali, everyone has done it. Why? No one else in the history of persons has ever been that inspiring. And as a matter of fact, if you had no New Testament, but you had the first, I'd say 600 years of art history in the Common Era, you can reconstruct scene by scene. Here, for example, these are the scenes of the Gospel of Mark that can be reconstructed scene by scene. Every scene in the Gospel of Mark can be reconstructed with art before you get to the Dark Ages. You have to destroy all of those buildings, all of those surfaces, all of those pieces of work if you want to erase the story of Jesus, along with the history of literature. And by the way, no one's had bigger impact on music. The history of music, the formation of music, the musical scales, minor scales, major scales, using harmonies, certain instruments. The fact you've got musical notation, Christ followers did all that. And if you look at a database of all of the top 100 artists in the last 100 years, even today, in the last 100, you'll come up with about 150 artists. Search their catalogs. All but two have sung a song about Jesus. No one has been sung about more in history than Jesus of Nazareth, even amongst people who aren't Christians. That's just in pop culture. That's in country and rap and Motown and R&B and you name it. He's affected. And by the way, from those songs, just the songs of the first 300 years of the Common Era, you can reconstruct this story of Jesus. You have to destroy the history of music also to get rid of Jesus. And of course, we talked about science, but we didn't talk about education. But education is interesting because if you went to the top 15 universities in the world today, all of them were started by Christians. About 75 of the top 100 universities are Christian. Christians have formed more universities than every other group combined. And on those campuses, they're still using the original buildings. They like to keep those old buildings in some of these Ivy League schools and some of these schools across Europe and some of these schools across the world. And in those original buildings, on those surfaces, you will find paintings and windows and etching and inscriptions from scripture. And from just the campuses alone, you can reconstruct the story of Jesus. And from the writings of scientists, I showed you, you could reconstruct the story of Jesus. And we didn't even talk about, that's all the stuff that secularists believe. But it turns out there are a bunch of world religions that are not Christian. All of these, for example. Do you realize the world's religions end up mentioning, merging, or modifying Jesus? This is what you can learn about Jesus from non-Christian religions. So it turns out Jesus is a person of interest in pretty much every category. But how could that be? How could this knucklehead be the guy who changes history and is so deeply entrenched that his fingerprints are all over the most important things that I, as an atheist, liked, that I thought was important as an atheist? That's literature, art, music, education, science. Those things are indebted to Jesus, his worldview, and the followers who actually embodied his worldview. How can that be? Why do we call it the first century? Because of this guy? I mean, think about it for a second. Here are all the other people in the first century. There are some world leaders here. There are some empire leaders here. These people all lived at the same time as Jesus, yet none of them had that kind of impact on history or on culture. None of them has been written about as much as Jesus, sung about as much as Jesus, painted or sculpted like Jesus. You won't find their writings in the fathers of science.
Jim, if you can hear me, a little frozen there. Sorry. You have to log back in. You're a little frozen there.